Okay, I'm back again, and I'm on part 3 of this section. Princess Royale travels in 20s, and somehow or another my connection got disconnected, but that's not too bad because that way I can break the book up into 3 parts. This chapter travels in 20s, and we last left off with Princess Anne as she was traveling and sightseeing with Princess Rainier and Princess Grace before flying to Seville to be the principal guest at the wedding of Prince Alexander of Yugoslavia, whom she had first met as Charles' contemporary at Gordonston. And this, I'm just going to show you pictures of Anne so you can see. Yeah, she did so much traveling. I mean, she really worked so hard at travel, and then on her downtime she's doing like the horses and racing, and her horse was Doublet. So I'm going to pick up in the next paragraph. Here too Anne touched an aspect of the fine feathered edge of diplomacy. On the death of his father, King Peter, Alexander refused to assume the role of pretender king in exile, and thus, freed of diplomatic impasse, the way was clear for the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, and Princess Anne to pay a state visit to Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia that autumn. Alexander and his bride, Princess Maria Gloria of Orleans Braganza, were still on their honeymoon. In fact, when they heard that their sunny wedding in Seville smoothed the way indirectly for the first visit of a British monarch to a communist country. Walking the streets of Belgrade in 1972, Princess Anne did not realize that, within the year, the way would clear the journey deeper through the Iron Curtain into the Republic of Ukraine, and perhaps to defend her European riding titles in the ancient capital of Kiev. But the deep shadows of Ekaterinburg were dispersed as readily in the hot sunshine as Ethiopia. In the course of her solo visit to the Emperor Haile Selassie during the Naval Week of Moscow, Anne stepped onto the deck of the Soviet destroyer Skritnik on the polite visit of inspection, and the white-capped sailors accorded her perhaps the first applause of royalty heard under the Russian flag for more than 50 years. Bluff Admiral Kruglikov explained that his ship was faster than the princess's horses. And Anne said, "Oh, you think so?" with a blissful smile. First attempts and first achievements were thus the foundation assets of popularity. If Princess Anne's official visits to Ethiopia and the Sudan received exceptional press coverage, she also earned it as an only presumptive Princess Royale. She led her entourage on a mule-back safari over the remote mountains that are called the Roof of Africa, to the pitched camp at 13,000 feet, and to the photograph the rare Walia ibex in the lost world of Simian Ranges. It was 3 of the most incredible days, as the princess said. Credibility was indeed strained, wrote one member of the expedition. By the sight of Mary Donning riding the jagged trail with the Harrods green shopping bag on her pommel, David, the chief inspector, David Coleman, the princess's detective, supposedly brought up the rear, but he was followed all the way up the mountain by a mule train of wild-looking characters who turned into white coat waiters at the wave of a stick. "If you think we're nuts," said Princess Anne calmly, watching one of the cameramen scrambling alongside, said, "I think you are barmy too." But she invited, You better come in and look. When the when they grew hysterical at the sight of her tent, they pitched in at the wildest heights of the expedition, and they furnished within minutes carpets, camp beds, sleeping bags, and pristine sheets and pillows. Advised to have medical checks before setting out, her chic and select retinue gasped in the thin and icy air. Not a week later, they were sweltering in the heat and the humidity of Khartoum. One recollects that Anne herself was seized with an African tummy, and yet with thought feeling shaking, she fulfilled the round of garden parties, charity balls, and special visits the protocol required before leaving Addis Ababa. In Khartoum, the Sudanese government was clearly aware that mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the noonday sun and had arranged the siesta hours should be thoroughly occupied with a visit to a youth center and a garden party. The next day, the schedule included a Khartoum College of Nursing, a flight of 200 miles to study the Gazira irrigation scheme, first to two schools with a youth folk display, tea with the Sudanese Women's Union, and finally, dinner with the foreign minister. Successful as the tour was in fostering goodwill, it further highlighted Princess Anne's salient characteristic in determining to do a job well, and no matter what the cost to herself, even in personal hazard. She was fully aware of the security risks in the troubled Sudan. Where only the week after her visit, diplomats were kidnapped and murdered by terrorists, and they had shrugged with one of her rueful, half-willful smiles. Once she sets her heart on a plan, nothing will dissuade her, wrote one of her close personal friends. When Anne flew out of Khartoum on Saturday night, the temperature had touched 107 degrees Fahrenheit, and her plane touched down at Heathrow just before dawn on a chilling February morning. Whereupon she surprised everyone very much, except those who knew her best, by driving straight from the airport to breakfast with Major and Mrs. Peter Phillips at their home in Great Somerford, Wiltshire, where their son Mark was at home on leave. Occasionally, amid the trivia of everyday royal events, there occur some small circumstances to which one must pay close attention. In these silver wedding year, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh had occasionally had to pay a sentimental visit to the Royal Naval College of Dartmouth, and an officer thought it strange to see Princess Anne in tow, in view of her growing independence. Sailing for Scotland a week earlier than usual, the Queen and her husband they paid an official visit to the Isle of Man for the royal yacht from the Royal Yacht Britannia, and daughter and parents found themselves in the highly unlikely situation of traveling together in a horse tram. But when the royal party disembarked at Aberdeen on 8 August, it was noticed that the princess had already jumped ship. But then, in fact, she was in Yorkshire, paying a visit to the Duke of Norfolk's eldest daughter, Lady Anne Fitzalan Howard, at Everham Park, where an alluring set of cross-country horse trials was held the following day. In one sense, it was equally no coincidence that Lady Anne's aunt, Lady Catherine Phillips, lived at one of the nearby farmhouses of the Everingham estate and happened just then to have her young nephew Mark as a house guest. Okay, this is where the romance of Mark Phillips and Anne starts to, blossom a bit. Look at the picture of Mark Phillips. He looks like his son Peter looks so much like him. So the Queen looked on with that detached amusement of hers. Young Mark probably still seemed one of Anne's ever-changing enthusiasms. Although the friendship had been progressing for some time, a few young people seemed to find so much to say to each other. In their remarkable, indeed unprecedented, press and television interview in the Palace Gardens after their engagement, Anne and Mark were to confess that their romance had deepened after badminton. Without precisely mentioning which badminton, it was the one thing thinks that the 1972 event, from which Anne had to withdraw doublet with such disappointment, while Mark, on great ovation, went on to win the leading trophy for the second year running. Anne's sense of a total muck-up in the sudden quenching of her prospect for the British Olympic team at Munich, it could be compensated only by her buoyant interest in the team itself, perhaps not least when Mark was selected. The team were guests at the Ascot Week house party at Windsor, and the Queen herself decided to go to Munich to see how they fared. As it turned out, her plan was canceled by more pressing events, but Anne followed her father to the games and was on her feet with excitement for most of the 3 days while she watched Richard Meade, Bridget Parker, Mary Gordon Watson, and Mark Phillips, nearly beside herself with wild joy in seeing the team at last win the gold medal. There's a moment in sport when the enjoyment wears off because of the pressure put on you to be successful, the princess says. That is the moment to stop and make sure in your own mind what sport is all about. And what it was it about? It concerned the personal achievement of winning and the enjoyment of good fellowship, and the satisfaction of an ever-widening experience as well as the proving of one's own ability. And though she hardly realized it at the time, it concerned the unexpected enchantment of falling in love. I scarcely thought about it at the time, the princess has said. Mark kept telling me he was a confirmed bachelor. The comparative lull after Munich was moreover quickly filled with Princess Anne's hope of defending her Raleigh trophy at the Burgundy 3-day event, especially in competition with Richard Meade, who had taken the Olympic individual equestrian gold medal. Declining an invitation to sleep at Burleigh House, she stayed at the George Inn in Stamford, decisively preferring the good company of other competitors to more formal surroundings. She had chosen to ride the Queen's big and powerful gray horse, Columbus, and was well up with the leaders in the calm dressage phase, only to suffer another dire catastrophe to her hopes the following day. On the steeplechase course, Columbus proved too much for her. On the second circuit, she realized that she was running with her and that she was no longer fully in control. The princess, she had little option but to pull up and to withdraw. Almost in tears and abandoning our chance at the finish, Columbus was a big double handful of a horse, as the experts have agreed. Let Mark have a go, said the princess. The queen obligingly loaned him the horse, and with Columbus, Mark increasingly discovered his own new world. Anne, in return, tried out Mark's horse, named Persian Holiday. Finding a holiday from a royal environment every time she stepped into the solid middle-class atmosphere of the Mount House at Great Somerford. The young couple almost mischievously seized every opportunity of meeting, usually with the excuse of discussing one horse or the other. One of the reasons why Mark's parents, Anne and Peter Phillips, had moved to the Mount House from Tewkesbury when Mark was 9 was the outbuildings that gave such a scope for the children's ponies. They never dreamed that they fostered a future royal courtship. And in the summer of 72, a neighbor who chanced to see Mark strolling around the stables with a young blonde took her merely as one of his sisters, Sarah's friends. For a few blissful months, indeed, the acrid smoke wisps of rumor conveyed nothing of the growing strength of their relationship. The contemporary popularity of Princess Anne carried with it a deep public wish for her success and fulfillment and lasting happiness, a desire so tangible that impatient imaginations gradually leapt ahead of a true event. The Princess and the Dragoon, as one writer put it, figured so often in friendship and riding rivalry that romantic speculation soon became inevitable. In many ways, it was fortunate that Lieutenant Phillips, as he was then, was soon transferred to Catterick Camp. Out of the metropolitan sight is out of the metropolitan mind, and Anne knew this from the Duchess of Kent, and the Yorkshire pays high regard to common sense reticence. The princess was welcome at Garrowby Hall whenever she wished, and at Catterick an army officer's wife had the surprise of her life when her husband mentioned, "My dear, I rather think Princess Anne would like to stay with us the weekend after next." Mark's commanding officer, Colonel Maurice Johnson, had remarked that he was in the picture from the start. And Princess Anne gained sharpened insight into the life of a young army wife, waiting for your man to come off duty and then all the more intensely enjoying his company. Looking back, the remembrance of the 6 weekends in Yorkshire will always glow for the couple from the year before their wedding. Life was suddenly a cinerama of hunting and hunt balls, dances, and lonely, unobserved moorland rides, of laughter and happiness, idyllic even to loopy attempts one day at Appleby to hold hands unnoticed after a picnic lunch at a gamekeeper's cottage. When Prince Philip went up to Balmoral for a few days' shooting, Anne accompanied an exceptional departure from routine, as if she were seeking a talk with her father, when she could count on finding him contentedly undisturbed and in his most genial frame of mind. Whether Mark had joined the party is unknown from Balmoral records, and public attention was sufficiently distracted just then by the indignant furor that raged around the princess's fox hunting. Okay, just a couple more pages. She has got a lot of run-on sentences, in my opinion. It's like, I don't know how people keep a fluid way of reading. She's got it. The sentence just runs on and on. The Duke of Windsor once asked Princess Anne why she did not hunt since she was so fond of riding. She replied in 2 words, blood sports. Fondly remembering his own hours of enjoyment in the hunting field and his sister's too, the Duke responded with equal brevity, a pity. The hunting fraternity might deem it a pity too that he did not live to see his grandniece at a meet of the Zetland, and then with the Bedhill hunt, and again with the Cheshire hunt, the Beaufort, and the Cottesmere, week upon week. The first news of these outings broke across the front pages with untimely coincidence on the very day of the Queen's silver wedding. Some wondered what, with the 18th century caricaturist Gilray, might have made of the flouting of the president of the World Wildlife Fund by his daughter's pursuit of the latest of Britain's largest carnivores. The abolitionist phrase about the pursuit of the unedible by the unspeakable became inconvenient when the pursuer was Princess Anne. The argument plunged the English into one of their typical convulsions of self-examination. One royal hunt was a news of story after a century of careful avoidance of blood sports. 2 or more expressed a willful defiance of the larger weight of public opinion. And then again, this seemed a not uncharacteristic echo of a Mountbatten stock, and some considered it admirable and typical of our generation that the princess should question old taboos and test controversial prohibitions for herself. More important to Anne was perhaps the novel excitement of keeping across unknown and unpredictable country. No matter what obstacles, particularly keeping up with Mark, especially Mark, who had suggested that inaugural day with the Zetland in the first place, notably Mark, when she stayed with his people at the Mount House again, when he was home on leave, and all of the old fox hunting prints about the house conveyed a timeless new meaning, emblems of the fun they had following the hounds of the Beaufort hunt. Twice in 5 days. The fox was, however, no longer the old fugitive. Anne and Mark were now becoming the quarry of all the world's news cameras. The popular press leapt, stronger than Columbus at any fence, at the prospect of a soldier boy taking his girl home to see his parents. In the new year of 1973, the flow of gossip deepened into an irrepressible flood when Mark spent his first 2 January weekends at Sandringham. Outside the gates, the reporters watched the pair riding into the wintry fog. When Mark left to join his regiment in Germany, the princess could not resist teasing the pressman. "I'm on my own today. A pity, isn't it?" Glancing over the papers, her sense of humor nevertheless lapses at times into burning indignation. Mark's light parting kiss on the quay of Harwich was exaggerated beyond measure in cold print. Mark had planned an Olympic team reunion at Summerford during his first weekend leave from Germany, only to find newsprints hints of a stolen weekend. It seemed fun to Princess Anne to rush home from the sedan and straight to the breakfast at the Mount House. and then drive direct with Mark to a training session at Mrs. Oliver's. But morning by morning, the stables were besieged increasingly by the reportage hordes. The quiet Berkshire Lane became a focus of expectation for a news-hungry world. Half in anger, more in dismay, Anne asserted one day that there was no romance and no grounds for these rumors of romance. Mark begged the reporters to remember that they were making the horses nervous. Indeed, everyone was becoming nervous, including, perhaps, the Queen's press secretary, Mr. Ludlow, who resigned on a difference of opinion a week or two later. Then, shortly before Badminton, the princess was thrown and trampled on by Mark's horse, Persian Holiday, and at the Russell's trials the following day, Mark was unseated, half rolled on and knocked out by the Queen's horse, Columbus. He had been able to hide his concern on hearing of Anne's accident, and Anne was white-faced as she rushed to the first aid tent for news on Mark. Happily, no bones were broken, and both laughed ruefully at their bandaged arms. It remains only to be said that Anne, riding the Queen's comparatively inexperienced Goodwill, came 8th in the 3-day white-bread event at Badminton, while Mark faced a final day of total disaster. Columbus threw him twice, including a ducking at the lake. Great Ovation went lame, and when he continued with Columbus, it was too late for retrieval. But he had already twice won the trophy. He had known the victor's laurels, and he won the hand of his fair lady. On 29 May, there came not the unexpected announcement in the court circular. It is with the greatest pleasure that the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh announce the betrothal of their beloved daughter, the Princess Anne, to Lieutenant Mark Phillips, the Queen's Dragoon Guards, son of Mr. and Mrs. Peter Phillips. And that is the end of Travels in Twenties. So and we will read the next section, which is another longer section, but this is where you get into the marriage of Mark and Peter Phillips, and then you get into the birth of the two children, Peter and Zara, and that's very interesting. So